As Roger already said, my name is Morten, and I work in local governance, you could say, in the city of Aarhus, a city of roughly 300,000 people in Denmark. And what I'll be talking about today is a bit of a mix from my past in academia, digging down into both ex-post appraisal of projects myself, but also meta-analysis across existing studies, pulling some of that, and then also trying to bridge that with the past 5 years I've had in local governance, trying to figure out how and what from these evaluations can we use in the way we both do ex-ante appraisal, but perhaps more in sort of what Morten in the previous discussion was talking about, like how does decision-making processes in general take place. And I think Tom ended the last session with a very nice question on the counterfactual, and I think that's going to be one of the crucial elements that I will touch upon at least. Just before heading into some of the things I'll be showing, which is initially very results orientated. Morten said that any presentation with ex post in its name couldn't be without presentation of results, and I'll bring it to the forefront instead. Just this is the Danish National Transport Authority's visualization of the different decision-making or analytical stages, I should perhaps say, of a larger project. And the results I'll be showing you are essentially all centered around the premise of a measure of inaccuracy of how well a forecast hit an outcome value, taking its point of departure in the forecast that were presented prior to a political decision, typically at what we'd call a CBA stage or an EIA stage, and then observations taking place in the first complete year of operation after the projects have been completed. So all the results that I'll be showing basically follows the bottom formula of a relatively simple measure of inaccuracy, where a positive value indicates that we've had more cost, we've had more demand than expected, and vice versa for a negative value. Summarizing across both studies I've conducted, studies that I know Morten have been doing, it seems like studies that Alan has been doing without having much knowledge of those myself. There are a couple general tendencies we can start seeing that hold true for more or less all these studies. The first is, perhaps not surprisingly, that construction costs are underestimated. That's not so revolutionary a finding. It's not exclusive to transportation projects either. And I'll not touch a lot on construction costs because my own work has been focused more on the demand side. But I think one part that holds true for studies of construction cost overruns is that there is a tendency for more complex projects to be more prone to construction cost overrun, which might not be surprising, and especially projects that have a large section of the construction taking place underground. The second point is that demand forecasts are generally biased. Morten mentioned that cost overruns don't deviate too much from a non-zero mean in Norway. I think my own studies, other international studies, especially those by Flubjerg throughout the time, have showed that there can be quite considerable non-zero means indicating the large biases on cost estimates, but the same is true for demand forecasts. The difference between construction cost estimates being biased and demand forecasts being biased is that the bias is different for different types of project, but it's also not a linear translation of, is it a good or a bad thing that construction costs are overestimated? Typically tend to be that the more cost or the higher cost compared to estimates, the worse off the project is. Not necessarily a bad project, just the worse off that indications show. That is not necessarily true for demand forecasts, which I'll return to in a bit more detail. But I think equally important is the third point, that demand forecasts are also highly imprecise. Some forecasts have a lot more traffic than expected. Some forecasts for a similar type of project have a lot less traffic. So the difficulty in using a mean inaccuracy from an exposed evaluation feeding into ex ante is something that also needs to be taken into account. And then I think the latter 2 points is stuff that we've covered both yesterday and today, that there are economic and non-economic effects that are not adequately addressed in appraisal. So I'll not speak much more on that. This slide really shows a sample of projects for studies I have done myself. On the left are the inaccuracy measures across a range of projects for road projects. On the right, you see the same for rail projects, and this is demand forecasts. So here you'll see outlined that there is a non-zero mean. If I can get Zoom to working, I can also see my slides myself, which in the case for road projects is around an average of 11% more traffic than expected. Not a large departure, you could say, but I think more importantly that there is a very large standard deviation indicating that some projects had triple the amount of traffic compared to forecasted traffic volumes, and some projects have less than half of the traffic. And it should be obvious that makes it rather difficult to use the consequential environmental analysis and not least the cost-benefit analysis as a valid measure of decision-making on the economic impacts. For rail projects, the converse is true. The average is negative, indicating that there's on average less ridership on rail projects that we tend to forecast, but also here the deviation is rather large. So some projects fare rather well, while other projects have as low as, I think, 20% was the worst project I encountered in my own studies, 20% ridership compared to forecast, which is obviously disastrous for the economic feasibility of such a project. One thing that I was quite interested in when I was doing my study, and which I haven't seen replicated in many other studies, is exactly what Tom was talking about. What about the counterfactual? And not that I can claim to have any detailed explanation of the causality of these forecasts, but I think one of the things that became possible from a range of projects that were either postponed, abandoned, or just not completed at the forecast target year was that we had an opportunity to compare what are the how accurate are the forecasts for the zero alternative or the no build alternatives. And it turns out that opposite of the completed alternatives, we have a negative mean for those values, indicated that on average, we have less traffic developing in the zero alternatives that the forecast actually shows. And I think there could be many reasons for this, but I think an obvious explanation to this is that we are not particularly good at assessing induced demand effects, since there is a tendency for more traffic to develop on roads after completion than expected, and conversely, there's a tendency for less traffic to develop on projects that are not completed when we just look at the sort of system develop. And I think there could be many reasons for this effect, simply that the models we have are not always very sophisticated. There's a tendency to use extrapolations of either national or regional traffic developments and trying to feed that in on a local network. But what happens in practice is that people are not willing to accept rising levels of congestion. So they either move, they find other places of work, they choose other times of departure, or they simply choose other means of transportation, typically switching to cycling or public transportation modes. I think the interesting part about all this inaccuracy or uncertainty, you could say, and the large deviations from expected values when we look at completed projects is not so much on the demand forecast themselves, but what happens if we try to feed that into, as Morten was saying, what happens if we do a full ex-post evaluation of a project, which is, I should say, rather resource demanding. But the British Highways Agency, or the UK Highways Agency, I should say it is, has for a number of years had a program called the Post-Opening Project Evaluation of Major Projects Scheme, POPE in short, that has done exactly that. At least it did when I was last invested in the research portion of this. And one of the things that they've spent some time on is actually trying to redo the cost-benefit analysis with the outcome variables of projects, and sample from projects that were compiled a decade ago is what you're seeing here, indicating that the travel time savings, which is by and large the dominant benefit factor of road construction, has a tendency to deviate quite large from the expected values. Only 18% of projects are actually within plus minus 15% of the expected travel time savings. Even 1/3 of the project lies beyond plus minus 50%, which is an underpinning of the fact that yes, these large deviation in travel demand forecasting also have a quite critical effect on the assessed feasibility of projects in economic terms. The same holds true for other types of impact variables. Another important one when we're talking road infrastructure being accident reduction rates. I think this graph essentially goes to show that it's pretty difficult to use the assessed accident reduction rates from appraisal of projects in ex ante to compare the viability of projects, given that many projects actually fail to achieve any reduction rate at all in terms of accident rates, despite it being perhaps one of the crucial elements for deciding to undertake the project. A final sample from the UK Highways Agency meta-analysis from a decade ago is that all these sub-objectives that I think Morten was also touching upon that are quite critical to at least local decision makers often are also having various degrees of robustness when we compare them with sort of the predicted values. And my new role in local governance is always, as Roger said, heading a team working with green mobility. So we are obviously quite interested in forecasting the greenhouse gas effects of various types of initiatives that we put forward to our policymakers. And sadly, that has proven to be, at least from the UK experience, the most difficult sub-objective, you could say, to actually get accurate predictions for, making it rather difficult using the travel demand forecasting as a basis of advising policymakers on how to best reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector, on a project level at least. Another thing that makes it tricky to utilize ex post evaluation results, whether some that you have conducted yourself, taken from academic or more practical studies, is that this initial rather simple measure of inaccuracy that I initially presented ends up proving difficult to utilize in practice. A simple reason for that is that often the prediction is made, let's say prediction was made last year for a project, time goes by, the project opens, could be in 2030, but the target year for the forecast might not have explicitly had in mind any realistic opening year. That's typically the case for Danish Rail projects, at least. The target year is typically set for a year well in advance when you know there's likelihood of having a mature system and the project is likely to be finalized. It could be 5 years after the actual completion date. So a direct comparison of the forecast ridership and the outturn ridership is likely to result in a ridership shortfall simply due to the fact that you're measuring a opening year that's prior to the actual target year for the forecast. Could also be the other way around, in which case you'd be likely to have the opposite inaccuracy bias, you could say. The difficulty arises in the fact that when you compare across studies, some researchers or some authors choose to adjust for the fact. Some authors choose to just present the raw inaccuracy measure, noting that it's likely to be a source of bias, and other again have more elaborate ways of adjusting for this measure. Just to give you an example of how I chose to do it myself in my own studies, using a simple sort of annual average growth factor to adjust for just a basic source of bias that could be our eyes for this. This is from another American study. It's using a much more comprehensive 10-year average for traffic development on trying to adjust for this. Point of this is not to go into detail with any of these formulas. It's more to say it can be rather difficult to compare, as Morten also hinted, that the experiences from one country or one study to projects that you find yourself being responsible for can be rather difficult to translate directly if you do not know or you do not utilize the same measure of inaccuracy. And that is not always straightforward to even determine what measure of inaccuracy has been used. And remedies for these things is something I'll return to a bit later. Another thing is that it's, as I think several people in the prior session before the break hinted at, is that ex-ante appraisal can be resource demanding, but ex-post appraisal can be equally resource demanding. So what often happens is that ex-post evaluations focus on ridership for a rail line on a specific segment or traffic on a road network on a specific segment. But what ought to be done is essentially looking at, as in this case here, a screen line across a corridor. In this case, I believe it was the A3 or a project on the A3 in the UK, looking at not only what is indicated as location B here, what happens on that specific segment of a road upgrade, but what happens on comparable corridor networks across the range of this corridor. And this is the sort of this is the comparison between expected and actual traffic on these different locations. And I think what happens in many studies that do not use the screen line approach is that you end up with something that's indicated by yellow here. And at location B, you had a much you had a pretty high induced demand effect of this road construction project. But when you start looking across the screen line, you notice that totally the effect on traffic in the wider area was actually not very drastic because it's simply a diversion of traffic to other modes. And I think Morten was also hinting on this, that it's difficult to find arguments supporting or evidence supporting that there's a large growth factor to these road infrastructure investments, simply because it's typically a competition between either local or regional authorities on attracting this growth. The problem is that if you have studies that are comparing inaccuracy or the inaccuracy of travel demand forecasting for road projects, you could utilize a project or a single corridor or a single segment approach and reach a large or the conclusion that the travel forecast was largely underestimated by quite a drastic amount. But if you use a screen line approach, it might turn out that the forecast was pretty much spot on, or at least that it did not have the large amount of induced traffic that would otherwise be indicated. Similar effects hold true for, in this case, a Danish Rail project that you see indicated by blue on this map, which was essentially built to alleviate some of the stress in inner Copenhagen. Those are the sort of the red and green lines you see to the right in this picture, simply because capacity constraints on the rail network in Copenhagen was making it difficult to upgrade service. This project turned out to have only, I believe, around 2/3 of forecast ridership. And as a result, there was a lot of criticism on the viability of this project. But if you look across overall service levels in the Copenhagen rail system, including the metro system, it was a massive upgrade simply because the amount of alleviation on the passenger stress on these other lines was still sufficient enough that they are now operating at a much higher service level, much higher levels of reliability. So I think an assessment of the overall impacts of such a project, it would be quite positive, but a simple measure of just the ridership impacts in its own financial viability of the corridor itself that was upgraded would turn out to be rather negative. I think I'll skip this slide because it's fast. It's from an old study by David Bannister and Mark Thurston Goodwin, essentially looking at what are the non-transportation effects of different types of rail projects. In this case, the Channel Tunnel Rail Link, Jubilee Line extensions, the Crosslink Rail, all of them UK projects, essentially indicating that the non-transport economic, the wider economic effects can be up to 3 times as large as the actual economic impacts of just the traffic effects. And I think that's something that other speakers have addressed, so I won't speak more into that. But obviously, it's important for the use of this into what can you say adjustments to the way we do ex-ante appraisal. I think Morten also hinted on this, that when you're talking about rail lines, it could be exceptionally complicated projects because they depend on so much more than just the infrastructure, service levels, among others. But I think most crucially is that many rail projects are undertaken in an order to either transform, typically in the case of urban light rail projects, transform an urban environment by offering a radically new transportation option, or in this case, as in sort of what can you say, a rural part of the greater Copenhagen area, to offer a new transportation alternative that should be the basis of new urban development in a site that's more or less a greenfield right now. So what you see on the left here is the proposed development plan around a new station area on a rail line called Nicolaisen Station, northwest of Copenhagen. And after the project was built, it turned out the ridership is, I think, 8% on this station compared to forecast. But when you look at Nicolaisen Station today, you'll see that there simply has been more or less no development investment compared to that was forecast. And I think that's true for many rail projects in Denmark and elsewhere, that many of them are built as a catalyzer for growth, but it can either be optimistic local planning, or it could simply be, as happened in 2008, there is a financial crisis, investment sort of plummets, and private investment is the key to driving many of these urban development sites. And once the economy recovers, the site just doesn't happen to be that interesting anymore. So investment is back, it's just locating elsewhere all of a sudden, and you're left with a rail line with no real purpose, at least not for this particular station here. We are running the same risk with a recent light rail completion as an expansion, you could say, of a high capacity network we're doing here in Aarhus. This is just north of the city, essentially a station placed in a greenfield development. Right now, we are finalizing plans for essentially an entire new city up here. But we are still crucially dependent on nothing going wrong, you could say, in the investment discussion with private real estate developers in this area. So we have the light rail, we have the station, we have all the sort of network facilities that need to be there, but we still don't know if the investment will pay off. And obviously, right now, ridership is nowhere near the forecast, and I think politically you are quite okay with that. But what happens 5-10 years from now is going to be what is really interesting. So again, reiterating Morten's point of saying, when do you measure whether a project has been a success or not? Can be rather difficult, especially at a local level for a project like this that has state co-financing, because someone is definitely looking at the money that has been pooled to a project like this locally from a state level, saying that soon this needs to turn out to be a success. Otherwise, we might not get funding for expansion lines of this kind of network upgrades. And I think that's that plays on many levels this impact of land use development. This is on the right. You see what is essentially the basic concept of land use development planning in the city of Aarhus right now and the surrounding municipalities. We have a vision saying we'd like to have a sort of polycentral urban development around nodes that are easily served both node-wise and corridor-wise with public transportation, whether it's BRT, normal bus lines, or light rail or heavy rail for that matter. What we don't want is a sprawling development all over the place that's going to be exceptionally car dependent. And politically, there's broad approval for this plan. When it was made in 2013, it was reiterated in a planning document from 2007 that we use for our overall master planning. But what happens right now, first of all, it's an election year for local government in Denmark, and we have private investors who are claiming to a city council that, you know what is really interesting right now for investment is single family housing. If you don't open up for single family housing development in Aarhus, we're going to look at the surrounding municipalities. Big red flag in city council. So now we're opening up in what you see on the right side here, right between what is indicated by yellow, our growth corridors along corridors we can easily serve with public transportation, but right in the middle, there's a big greenfield development now opening up for, I believe, 15,000 people, which is essentially going to be a large amount of single family housing, meaning that already now we know that planned light rail expansion lines are going to suffer in terms of ridership because we're not really sticking to the land use plan we made for this project. And I think that's perhaps the single most crucial aspect of having financially feasible investment in rail infrastructure is making sure you have a land use plan that supports it and also that politically you're actually sticking to once you're starting to face opposition. I don't know how I'm doing on time, Roger, so if we're facing sort of the end of my allotted time slot, feel free to speak up. I can summarize rather quickly some of the points. I just want to...
You've got another 5 minutes.
Great. Then I can just show you some examples of more practically what, maybe not so much how do we utilize ex post evaluation, but how can you make different frameworks that will allow your ex ante appraisal to point in different directions. This is a picture I've taken from Google Street View of a main sort of artery, traffic artery into the city center of Aarhus from 2009. We've since built a light rail going in through this corridor. So this is, you could say, once we started planning for this, this is what you typically consider the original baseline for a project that we'd use as a no-build alternative for our traffic estimates, our cost estimates. But because, as Morten has already hinted, there's a rather large planning phase until actual construction can be undertaken if the project is even approved. And also because we knew this was going to be a rather large intervention in the traffic system, what was done as sort of an interim solution was to say, well, we want to expand the road dimensions here, or the traffic corridor dimension here. So we knocked over some housing. On the right side of this picture, we expanded the road, we added dedicated bus lanes to at least have some sort of transfer system into this high capacity rail system that we were building, which happened prior to any conclusion on the cost benefit analysis of the light rail itself, including the co-financing from sort of national level on this. So this became the new baseline, even though the only reason we undertook this was to prepare for the light rail itself. What happens afterwards is that now the buildings are demolished, the road space is expanded, we have our light rail, which we're quite happy with, but the economic evaluation of this project turned out to be very positive, you could say, simply because we compared with the system where we'd already knocked over buildings, we'd already expanded the roadway, so all the cost associated with that was taken care of in sort of a local expense, and also all the impediments for car drivers that we were enforcing, not least in signaling, here was already taken account of. So the punishment, you could say, that you face both in sort of construction costs for this part of the project and the detrimental effects to the car drivers were already taken care of in this project. But had the light rail itself been compared to the original sort of section you see here, you'd probably have a project appraisal that had fared much worse off. And I think we find ourselves in a current situation, contemporary appraisal of a new light rail expansion on a site like this, where we're not trying to game the system in any way, just trying to say, well, we have an urban development site here that we need to somehow offer a new transportation system to, but we are probably 8 years ahead of actually going into the ground, building new rail here. So we're considering doing more or less the same here, expanding the roadway, adding high capacity buses, but we also know at the same time that that will just end up showing a much higher feasibility for the light rail project itself. And I think it's difficult to make an assessment of when is actually the good baseline for national interest in terms of investing in this project to pinpoint. And I think the 5 minutes are probably soon up, or at least I think the discussion is what has been most fruitful in these segments. So I think the last thing I'd like to pinpoint is that resource allocation needs to be dedicated. It needs to be mandatory if, as Roger hinted at initially, ex-post evaluation is to have a relevance, or at least an important relevance for the way we do ex-ante appraisal and the way we do decision making. Simply because this is a picture from my own PhD around a decade ago. I'd like to hope that that data can be found in more electronic formats today, but it's such a cumbersome endeavor to try to make informed ex-post appraisal on all the necessary items that if you do not have a systematic mandatory appraisal system such as the ones that Morten and Alain has hinted at, or at least some of the stuff that the UK Highways Agency has been practicing for a number of years now, it is more or less impossible to have ex-post evaluations at a quality required to make informed decisions, whether it's for decision making in general or to feed into the way we do ex-ante appraisals. So I think that would be the most important recommendation out of all of this, is that the first step in order to make such improvements. Thank you.